I am happy to have Automotive Seminars as a sponsor for the show. Now, if you're not familiar, Automotive Seminars is a diagnostic technician training company. They've got a website that there'll be a link to in the show notes. And what they offer is top-notch training to technicians like us in the field. I've been taking their training courses for years and have got a ton of benefit out of it. They've got top-notch instructors, John Thornton, Scott Shotton, Scott Manna, and every other month they've got a 2-night course that you can sign up for. Join in, ask questions, and afterwards, you've paid for the course, you can access a recorded version whenever you want. You can rewatch the class 2 years later in case you wanted some details on it, and that is a fantastic feature. So make sure to check out the website to see what courses they have available and what's coming up in the future. This podcast is brought to you by Jarhead Diagnostics. Jarhead Diagnostics manufactures in-house diagnostic equipment and storage solutions, as well as distributes for companies like Pico, ATS, and TopDon. One of my favorite tools that I've bought from Brandon and Jarhead Diag is the case for the U-Scope. If you don't have a U-Scope, you probably should, but if you have one, you got to get one of these 3D printed cases, has a magnet on it, has a full-size BNC lead that you can connect to, and it gets rid of the weak point of that scope, which is the mini BNC connection, which is pretty fragile. This case makes this thing nice and secure and makes it an even better tool than it was. So check out jarheaddiag.com. The link is in the show notes. This episode is brought to you by L1 Automotive Training and Keith Perkins. If you're looking for education on module programming, J2534, EEPROM work, key and immobilizer, electrical diagnostics, or drivability diagnostics, Keith has a website, l1training.com, that's got over 60 hours of training videos on all those subjects and more. When I first started out doing mobile, I utilized Keith's videos on module programming in J2534 in order to get my head wrapped around what I would need for the tooling, the computers, the software setups, what kind of obstacles I would be up against when I'm out there programming modules on cars. And it was a huge benefit to me. And I continue to use the training videos that he has on his website. So I strongly recommend checking out l1training.com. We have got Auto Rescue Tools and Isaac Rodell as a sponsor for this podcast. Hey guys, if you're looking for programming laptops, you want the laptop set up ready to go for programming control modules on vehicles, you need key cutting equipment, you need diagnostic tools, Isaac is your guy. Has all that stuff available for purchase, and the support that he offers along with the purchase has been outstanding. I bought some stuff from him in the past. I got my Dolphin key cutting tool from him several years back. And again, the support has been phenomenal. Helped me out along the way with anything additional I needed to make it work for me. Also, for the month of June 2023, they've got Autel updates for sale. So make sure to check that out as well. Again, that's autorescuetools.com. The link will be in the show notes. Hey, what's going on, automotive world? Welcome to the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. My name is Sean Tipping, and I've got another tech tip for you today. I haven't done one of these in a while, but I had one last week that I thought this might be helpful. Maybe you've run into this before. Maybe you haven't, but I'll give you the solution in case you do. Just a reminder, these tech tip episodes, short, simple, to the point, no intro music, no outro music. So that being said, let's get to it. This is a 2013 Jeep Wrangler with a 3.6 4x4. The shop actually called me to look at this vehicle. They had replaced the transmission in this vehicle. It's automatic transmission, and they're getting a code, a P0731, which is incorrect gear ratio in first. And this code is present now, and it was present before the transmission replacement as well. So we need to figure out what's going on with this thing. Is it another bad transmission, or is there something else going on? So what this code states, if you look at the details of the code, and honestly, I don't think the shop did, because the code in the factory service info pretty much tells you what to do here. But there are some other details of this I'm going to walk you through to make it helpful in fixing a problem like this, and some things you want to do and look for. Anyways, it says in the code definition, okay, again, incorrect gear ratio in first, is that the TCM constantly calculates transmission ratio based on transmission speed sensors. There's a couple of them. And calculated output shaft speed. So what is the calculated output shaft speed? If you look in the details of the TCM operation, it specifically states that the ABS, the wheel speed sensors, are bussed into the TCM. So it's using those as a calculation, right? And so we are utilizing the wheel speed sensors, and it doesn't directly lay it out in the code, but once you figure out what's going on with this, it makes a lot of sense why it actually is looking at the wheel speed sensors. When it's looking at this code, anytime over 6 miles an hour, there's no ABS or transmission errors. And really all it's looking at is to see, is the gear ratio that is selected correct? And if it's not, sets this code, puts the transmission into limp mode, which it did, which is going to lock you in whatever your current gear is until you put it into park, and then you're limited to second gear only in this transmission limp mode. And of course, that's what's happening to this thing. Every time you drive it over 6 miles an hour, it sets this code and goes into the limp mode and won't let you shift that transmission. So, is the gear ratio actually not correct? What's actually happening here? Obviously, the computer thinks it is. Again, if you read the code, you go a little further down to the code definition, it says one of the first things that you should check is that the pinion factor is set correctly in the TIPM. Okay, so the TIPM is your fuse box that's under the hood. You could consider it a body control module, I guess, but Chrysler TIPM, a pretty common part. Most of us are familiar with them for one reason or another, but that's where the pinion factor is stored. And this is actually a setting that's been around on Chryslers for as long as I can remember. You know, when you had a bidirectional scan tool, you'd set the pinion factor in a lot of vehicles. Well, again, this one's stored in the TIPM, and you can actually change or set this pinion factor through a scan tool function. You don't need a special programming device most of the time. You can also do a restore vehicle configuration if you have the YTech setup. That's going to use Chrysler server and restore everything to the factory settings. That is one option. Wouldn't have fixed this one. Here's why. And this is obviously something I didn't mention, but I saw right away when I walked up the vehicle. This thing has aftermarket wheels and tires. And not only that, but I took a look underneath the vehicle because someone had put on big rims, big tires. They had also changed the gear ratio. And the only reason I know that is that the differential covers were clearly aftermarket. They had some weird design on them that definitely was not factory Chrysler diff covers. So somebody had been in there and most likely changed the gear ratio of the axles, the actual differentials, ring and pinion, and we've got aftermarket wheels and tires, which are not a factory size for the tires. And this is pretty common for Jeep Wranglers, right? It's what people buy them for, is to go, rock climbing and off-roading and all the stuff you do with the Jeep. So I asked the shop, I'm like, did this stuff just get put on? What do you know about this? And they didn't know anything besides the fact that, it's got aftermarket wheels and tires. So this is my suspicion here, is that our gear ratio that the computer expects is different from what it actually is. Now, why isn't it set correctly? I don't know, honestly. And I never did find out why it wasn't set correctly. Maybe somebody replaced the TIPM at some point. Maybe somebody put this stuff in and never fixed it. That seems unlikely, but who knows? Anyways, I need to fix it. I need to make sure before I go any further that the correct gear ratio and the correct tire size are entered into that TIPM. So currently, if you go in there, it gives me, in the scan tool, I'm just using the launch right now, it gives me a list of tire sizes to pick from, and none of them are what's on the vehicle. It was like a 315 that was on the vehicle, and I think the biggest one was like a 285. It gave you several options, but not the one I had on the vehicle. And in the gear ratio, it listed a 3.55 or 3.55 to 1 gear ratio. Is that right? Is that what's in here? I have no idea. And I asked the shop, but they had no idea about the gear ratio. I'm like, okay, so I'm gonna have to figure this out. The tire size, obviously I know the tire size, but it's not an option. What do I do here? This is where HP Tuner's cable actually came in really handy. And I got to give credit to Garrett Jacobson because he had mentioned this on one of the previous podcasts that you could do this function, and it worked like a charm. Very, very easy. And I should note that, you pay the $300 for the HP Tuner's cable. Obviously, there's the tuning side of things, which I haven't really messed with, but there's a scanner function, right? And we talked about how good the graphing features were for fuel trims and stuff like that. But on these Jeeps, there's also a function within that scanner where you can change the tire size and the gear ratio to whatever you want. It doesn't have to necessarily be a factory tire size, because that was my only options in the scan tool. I can change it to whatever tire size that is actually on the vehicle, and I can enter whatever gear ratio is actually in the vehicle. So again, tire size, pretty easy to figure out. It's stamped on the side of the tire. It wanted the circumference of the tire, so I actually just used a Google calculator for tire size to circumference of the wheel. That, again, easy enough to figure out. Most of us can figure that out. But what about the gear ratio? Hey, what do we do? Do we pull the diff cover, count the teeth? Do we, get a hold of the customer and try to figure out where this thing's been and what happened? There's another way that you can do this. This is the way I chose to go because I just want to get this stuff done, right? And the vehicle's in the shop. I have them raise the vehicle off the ground. And in order to do this, it's easy to have two people. I use the video on my phone to help me with the counting, but you're going to look at the prop shaft going into one of the axles. I picked the front axle. The other thing you're going to want to do is block one of the wheels, right? So if I'm looking at the front axle, I would block one of the wheels or leave it in two-wheel drive. That's the other thing I did. But if you're doing the rear axle, you're going to block one of the wheels. You're going to go to the other wheel, the wheel that's not blocked. Okay. Or again, I'm doing the front axle, so I just left it in two-wheel drive. So what I mean by that is if I spin one wheel on the front axle and two-wheel, the opposite wheel on the passenger side doesn't move. And that's what I'm after. That's what I want. I want the wheel to spin and the prop shaft to spin, nothing else. That's my goal. Okay. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark my tire in reference to my fender. So I'm going to make some sort of indication that, this is the 12 o'clock position on my tire and it matches up with this line on the fender. You can use, a piece of tape or something like that. And then I'm going to make a mark on the prop shaft where it goes into the front differential. Okay. I'm going to spin the wheel 10 times. And again, you don't want the other wheel to spin when you do this, but I'm going to spin the wheel 10 times, which of course is going to spin that ring gear 10 times. And I'm going to count and see how many times my prop shaft spins in those 10 rotations. Okay. And however many times that prop shaft spins in 10 rotations, it happened to be about 24 and a half, not perfect, but about 24 and a half rotations within my 10 rotations of my wheel. I'm going to double that number. Okay, so double 24 and a half, and you get 49. So you have 49, take your decimal point, move it one over to the left. So instead of 49, I now have 4.9, or if you look at the list of possible gear ratios, 4.88. And I think if I would have precisely measured the rotations of that prop shaft, I would have come up with 4.88, but of course, 4.9 is very close to that. So that's my gear ratio. And I double checked it on the rear axle and they're the same. So that's what I enter. So I put in my new tire circumference with HP tuners and I put in the 4.88 gear ratio. We go drive this thing. And I mean, entering that stuff was simple. It is a few clicks of a button. It'd take you 5 minutes. I go drive this thing, shift through all the gears, no codes, good to go. Sweet, awesome, easy fix. And, you can charge a decent amount of money for that. These guys were incredibly happy that the vehicle was fixed, and it takes you very little time to figure this out. I mean, honestly, figuring out the gear ratio was the lengthiest part of this diagnosis to fix the vehicle. But I do think there are other tools that will allow you to change the tire size and gear ratio besides HP tuners. I think somebody told me that Alpha OBD2 could do it. I'm sure there's other examples as well. But the factory tool, or
your regular aftermarket scan tool was not able to change the tire size outside of whatever the factory settings were. I think I might have been able to do the gear ratio, but without the tire size set correctly, we still would have had an issue, again, because the vehicle is using wheel speed sensors. But that's going to be it for today. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get out there, fix the world, one car at a time.